Shanaz Elika, who has a substantial training in neuroradiology, several fellowships, and especially in head and neck and pediatrics. So we're looking forward to your presentation, and Shanaz, this is your house.
Thank you. So today what I'm going to be talking on is pediatric non-traumatic head and neck emergencies. Actually what I'm going to cover are basically otologic infections and their complications. We're going to look at paranasal sinus infections and complications. And then quickly we'll look at facial, oral, pharyngeal and neck infections. And then if we have time, I'll go through airway obstruction in kids. So we'll see how much we can cover. It's a long talk. So to start with, we'll start with otologic infections. So acute otomastoiditis is basically a mucoperiosteal disease, and most cases of acute otomastoiditis resolve with antibiotics. But if you don't treat it, or if the treatment is not adequate, then the mucoperiosteal disease actually becomes a bone disease. And then what happens is that you get thinning and erosion of the mastoid septa, and then you get development of an intramastoid abscess, and that's when this uncomplicated mastoiditis becomes complicated, or it's also called coalescent mastoiditis. And this is a list of all the complications. We'll look at most of them, especially the common ones. And this is actually an image, actually an axial temporal bone CT image, actually showing you an intramastoid abscess. Here you can see the mastoid septae are destroyed. This is how normal mastoid septae look. You can see there's opacification of the mastoid air cells. There's destruction of the mastoid septa, and there is an intramastoid abscess. So this is also called an intramastoid empyema. So now this is a complicated mastoiditis, or this is also called coalescent mastoiditis. So the infection can then spread along various paths. So if you have destruction of the external mastoid cortex, then the infection can spread out and give rise to a subperiosteal abscess. So this is an example where there is destruction of the external cortex, the infection spreads out, you have a subperiosteal abscess, and there are surrounding cellulitic changes in the scalp, and then you can see also the pinna is kind of displaced anteriorly. Also, you can have involvement of the inner mastoid cortex, and once the inner mastoid cortex is breached, then the infection gets access to the extra-axial spaces in the intracranial compartment. It gets access to the sigmoid sinus as well as access to the cerebellum. So in this case, you can see that there is a destruction of the inner mastoid cortex, but there is no intracranial extra-axial collection such as an epidural or subdural empyema. You can see the sigmoid sinus is intact, and there is no evidence of dual sinus thrombosis. Now, when you have destruction of the mastoid tip, you can get a Bezoar's abscess, but in kids you don't commonly see that because the mastoid tip is not pneumatized. So it's uncommon to see Bezoar's abscess in a kid, but then usually it's when you have infection in the mastoid tip and it tracks deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So these are again various examples. This is an example where you have opacification of the mastoid air cells as well as the middle ear cavity. This is the middle ear cavity. You can see there are osteomyelitic changes involving the bone. There's destruction of the outer cortex or the external cortex, and there is a subperiosteal abscess right there. Also, there is destruction of the other osteomyelitic changes involving the inner mastoid cortex, and you have an epidural empyema. Again, this is a coronal view showing you that epidural empyema. And you can obviously see the bony destructive changes. This one actually shows you the subperiosteal abscess with surrounding cellulitic changes. This is another example. Here you can see that there is destruction of the inner mastoid cortex. Again, you see the opacification of the mastoid air cells in the middle ear cavity. And when you look closely, you see that there is a intracranial extra-axial collection, which is like an epidural empyema. And that epidural empyema is causing mass effect and effacement of the left sigmoid sinus, but there is no durovenous sinus thrombosis at this point. This is actually again the coronal view showing you the destruction of the inner mastoid cortex, again showing you the epidural empyema, and this is actually a good view showing you the epidural empyema as well as the sigmoid sinus, which is effaced but is not thrombosed. And then the other point I kind of want to stress on with this image is basically you see that there is no destruction of the external mastoid cortex, but you see a subperiosteal abscess. So you need not have bony infection, but infection can spread through retrograde through thrombophlebitis. I mean retrogradely through thrombophlebitis of the emissary veins. So here you see a large subperiosteal abscess and surrounding again cellulitic changes. So you need not have bony destruction, even though the bone apparently looks normal. Infection can again spread through these valvulus emissary veins. Another example, this is an MR, again showing you the epidural empyema, the subperiosteal abscess, the surrounding cellulitic changes, and in this case you can see the epidural empyema is actually, this is a more superior image, it's actually extended across the petrous temporal bone and extended into the middle cranial fossa. On diffusion weighted image you can see the abscess actually shows restricted diffusion. This is actually a coronal view again showing you that abscess, epidural empyema actually extending into the middle cranial fossa. And this is actually a view more superiorly, this is a post-contrast T1 weighted image actually showing you that the sinus is patent and that there is some dural thickening and enhancement along the floor of the middle cranial fossa, and you need to pay very close attention because then the infection can spread from here and extend into the temporal lobe. So those are the things that you want to look for. You want to look for the cerebellum to see if there is any cerebellitis or cerebellar abscess, and if it extends along the tegment tympani or is in this case across the top of the petrous bone, you also want to look for middle cranial fossa complications such as this, as well as temporal lobe cerebritis or abscess. The other complication with otomastoiditis is dural sinus thrombosis. How does it look on non-contrast CT? You just see increased density of the thrombosed sinus, and on contrast enhanced CT you see empty delta sign. On MR, you can actually directly visualize the clot on T1 and T2 weighted image depending on the age of the clot, and we'll look at caveats to that. On the T2 star sequences, which are specifically made to kind of highlight blood products, you see blooming of the clot on these susceptibility or T2 star sequences, or they also call SWI images, susceptibility weighted images. And you can actually see the filling defect on either post-contrast T1 or on the MRV. So this is an example again showing you that there is opacification of the mastoid acids in medullary cavity, destruction of the inner cortex, and you can see this epidural empyema. You can see the cellulitic changes in the overlying soft tissues. In this case, you can see this is a coronal bone window of the CT, again showing you destruction of the tegment tympani. And in these cases, you want to look very closely at the middle cranial fossa, because then the infection can spread to the middle cranial fossa and the temporal lobe. Now, this is the same patient. I've got a more cranial image. You can see that there is this big filling defect within the right sigmoid and transverse sinus, which is actually sinus thrombosis, which is better seen on the coronal image. You can see the normal sinus opacifying over here, and this is the sinus. This is actually almost akin to the empty delta sign. You see the filling defect, which is non-enhancing and enhancement of the surrounding sinus/dura. This is again on the sagittal view showing you that empty delta sign, the non-enhancing clot surrounding enhancement, either suggesting the non-thrombosed part of the sinus and or adjacent enhancing dura. This is actually a video just to show you, just scrolling up and down just to show you the, because this is a little complicated and you can actually miss things if you don't look carefully. So just look, this is the IJV. You can see this is the sigmoid sinus. Here the sigmoid sinus get attenuated. This is the epidural empyema. And then as you come up, further up, that's again the sinus. And then again over here, there's this transverse sigmoid junction. And then this is the whole thrombosed lateral portion of the transverse sinus. Again, showing this to you on the coronal CT video. So that's the empyema, that's the whole thrombosed sinus right there. That's the thrombosed sinus, that's the empyema. So you need to be very careful. You need to differentiate the empyema from the thrombosed sinus.
Yeah. These are acquired with a 3 Tesla or 1.5?
Some of them are 1.5, some of them are 3. It's all a mixed bag. They're both kinds of images are there. So this is the same patient this is the MR on the same patient. This MR is obtained after drainage of the mastoid infection. You can actually see the epidural empyema here. It's enhancing peripheral enhancement. The empyema has become a little bit smaller. You can see restricted diffusion on the DWI images, both within the mastoid as well as within the empyema. And then this is actually the sinus thrombosis. This is what I was talking about, the T2 star or the SWI images. And you can see the clot actually blooms beautifully on this, and you can pick up the durovenous sinus thrombosis really nice on these SWI images. Now, the caveat that I was talking about is on the T2 weighted image. If you have deoxyhemoglobin, which is acute blood clot, you can see that it looks dark on T2, and normal sinuses with flow voids actually look dark, so you can miss this clot on the T2 weighted image. So you really need to look at other imaging sequences, like on the flare, you see this is the normal flow void of the sinus. Here it looks a little bit more lighter than the contralateral normal side, And obviously on the post-contrast T1 weighted images, it's quite clear. You see the normal enhancing sinus and this big filling defect, the clot in the sinus. Again showing you the clot in the coronal view, and this is again to show you that coronal T2 can be very misleading. So on MR, you're just not looking at one sequence, you're looking at multiple sequences, and basically you need multiple sequences to help you reach a diagnosis. And obviously, if you suspect dural venous sinus thrombosis, you're going to add in an SWI as well as you're going to add in an MR venogram. So this is actually just a video showing you the susceptibility weighted image. Even bone appears really dark on that. Again showing you, see that sinus, the thrombosed sinus is really dark. So because, so I don't want to get into the physics of it, but any kind of blood product, especially paramagnetic from deoxy onwards, it shows blooming. That darkening is called blooming on these T2 star or SWI images. So that's something to add on to your sequences if you suspect dural sinus thrombosis. The next group of infections we're going to talk about is basically paranasal sinus infections, and we look at a host of complications of these. Basically, I don't want to look at just routine paranasal sinus infections. We're mostly going to look at how complicated paranasal sinus infection looks like. So these are the complications that you see with sinusitis. You can get orbital, intracranial, vascular or superficial complications, and we'll look at each one of these. So the orbital complication is the most common complication that you see. And usually the orbital complication is secondary to the ethmoid sinus, and that's not difficult to understand because the ethmoid sinus is closest to the orbit. And in the orbit, usually if you have preseptal infection, the orbital septum actually prevents the spread of infection to the postseptal space. But later on in the infection, it can get transgressed, and you can get extension of infection/inflammation into the postseptal space. So this is a nice article showing you the different types of orbital infections. You can have preseptal cellulitis or abscess. You can have a postseptal subperiosteal abscess or phlegmon. This is actually a abscess. You can either have a phlegmon or abscess. You can have a true orbital cellulitis, which is involvement of the intraconal space. This is actually cellulitis, or you can have abscess. And then finally, you can have involvement of the superior ophthalmic vein or the cavernous sinus. So there are different types of complications that you see, and we'll look at each one of these. The preseptal cellulitis, here the infection is limited to the skin and subcutaneous tissues of the eyelid. Again, it's anterior to the orbital septum, and the orbital septum prevents the infection going postseptally. And this is one of the most complex, common and least severe of all the complications. So this is an example of preseptal cellulitis. Again, you can see there's swelling in the preseptal soft tissues and narrowing of the palpebral fissure. This is an example of a patient with preseptal cellulitis. You see all this thickening and enhancement within the preseptal soft tissues. Now in this patient there's no sinusitis, but one of the other causes of preseptal cellulitis is an insect bite. So this kid had an insect bite, so the preseptal cellulitis was from an insect bite. But just to show you how preseptal cellulitis looks, and again you can see over here there's no evidence of postseptal cellulitis. So the orbital septum was good enough to actually prevent the spread of infection postseptally, or the patient got treated early. Next, we go to the postseptal space and we'll look at subperiosteal abscess. This is most commonly secondary to sinusitis. Again, commonly located in the superomedial or infromedial orbit, again because it's close to the ethmoid sinus there. And the infections spread through breaks in the lamina pepritia, or they can travel through the anterior and posterior ethmoid foramen. So here's an example. Here you have opacification of the paranasal sinuses, especially on the left. And then here you can see that there is a subperiosteal abscess in the extraconal space of the left orbit, and you can see that it's causing displacement of the left medial rectus muscle. There's proptosis of the globe, and you can see preseptal cellulitic changes also. Another example, again in the superomedial aspect of the globe, here you see sinusitic changes in the supraorbital ethmoid air cells. Again, you can see some mild thickening of the superior oblique as well as the superior rectus muscles. So how does a subperiosteal abscess look? You have this elliptical collection with peripheral enhancement. You can have proptosis, which we saw. You can have increased density of the extraconal fat, and you can have enlargement of the extraocular muscles. And we'll look at some of these examples. Here's the same example that I showed you here to highlight how this edema of this extraocular muscles look. You can see that, and you can see all this stranding of the fat, which is what I talked about in the previous slide. So subperiosteal abscess, enlargement of the extraocular muscles. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is the superior ophthalmic vein, but we'll come to that in the vascular complications. Now we'll talk quickly on intracranial complications. There are two mechanisms how infection spreads from the sinus to the intracranial compartment, either direct extension or retrogradely through the valvulus diploic veins. So it's very easy to understand intracranial complications if you go from inside out. So infection can spread to the epidural space, you can get an epidural empyema. From there it can go into the subdural space, you can get a subdural empyema. You can have involvement of the leptomeninges and get meningitis. You can have involvement of the, you can get involvement of the brain, so you can either have cerebritis or cerebral abscess. You can get involvement of the venous thrombosis, venous sinuses and have venous thrombosis, and then that can lead to venous infarctions. And finally, if you have involvement of the, you can have arthritis or arterial spasm, and we'll look at how, look at examples of these. This is an example of a patient with frontal sinusitis, and this is a left frontal epidural empyema. You can see it's actually lenticular hypodensity with peripheral enhancement. There's a small air pocket within that collection. Again, the same thing on MR, again showing you the sinusitic changes and the epidural empyema. And this is how the empyema looks on DWI, showing you restricted diffusion, again within the empyema as well as within the frontal sinus, suggesting pus within the sinus. This is a sagittal view, again showing you the empyema and the frontal sinusitis. So epidural abscess looks, it's a convex elliptical low density collection on CT, adjacent dural enhancement and decreased diffusion on MR. Another example, I'll show you a lot of examples because unless you know what the complications are, it's very hard to look for them. So this is an example which actually illustrates that. So this is a patient who's got extensive sinusitis, especially on the left. This patient has a subperiosteal abscess, as you can see here. There is preseptal cellulitic changes, there's proptosis of the globe, there's displacement of the globe laterally. You can see enlargement of the medial rectus muscle over here, especially you can see that on the coronal reformatted images. And what I want you to pay attention at is actually the small epidural collection. If you were not aware or not looking for it, it's very easy to miss this. So you really need to look for small collections. You have to be very careful, look adjacent to those areas of the frontal sinuses for these small epidural abscesses, because if you don't look carefully for them, you can miss them. So this is what it looked like. This patient got an MR. And that's that, just to show you that that is an abscess. You can see restricted diffusion within that epidural empyema. So if you're not looking for it, you'll miss it. So these collections can be very tiny. So once you see something like this, look very carefully intracranially to look for these small empyemas. This is another example. This is a patient again with sinusitis. You see these crescentic collections within the extracranial space. Again over here on CT, obviously you don't see it that well. This is a non-contrast CT. You can see that collection there, and there's a lot of, you see all this cortical edema within the temporal and frontal lobes. Basically that's all cerebritis, but there's no abscess formation at this stage. And you can see on the post-contrast scans, you can see there's all this leptomeningeal enhancement. I don't know if you can see that, or the blue arrows, they're basically the leptomeningeal enhancement. So this patient has subdural empyema, he has leptomeningitis, and he has cerebritis without abscess formation. So it's very important. Back when I trained in CHOP, I know a lot of the surgeons say that they won't go in to drain an epidural empyema if it is small, but they will go in to drain a subdural empyema, because that suggests that infection can spread very rapidly intracranially. So if there's a small subdural, they go and drain it, but epidurals, if it's small, they actually wait it out. So something to look for. You really need to look for these subdural empyemas, and also for leptomeningitis, because they might be very subtle and you can miss it. Obviously this is not a subtle case, but you need to pick up those small ones which later on turn out to become like this. So how does a subdural abscess look? Like I showed you, crescentic low density collections, peripheral enhancement, and decreased diffusion on the DWI images. This is a DWI image showing you that crescentic hypodensity of the subdural abscess. This is another example. This is also something which I learned while training, that if you have sphenoid sinusitis in children or young adults, always pay very close attention to the brain and to the dural venous sinuses, because it's very easy for infection to spread intracranially. So this is a patient who's got sphenoid and ethmoid sinusitis, and they actually got an MR because this patient was having terrible headaches. And you can see over here this is along the planum. This is a coronal T1 post-contrast. You can see there's enhancement of the dura, suggesting that there is pachymeningeal involvement. There was no leptomeningeal disease, there was no epidural empyema, but it just shows you that this infection was actually spreading slowly intracranially. And the MR images are not very good because this patient had braces, but again showing you the opacified sinus. Again, the disease has not spread into the cavernous sinus or elsewhere in the brain, and this is actually a small incidental arachnoid cyst. It's not an empyema. But just as a thought, when you see sphenoid sinusitis isolated or posterior ethmoid sinusitis, you need to do other imaging modalities to make sure that the images, so that infection, to just look whether there's any intracranial extension, because technically this would be a type of intracranial extension, just dural thickening and pachymeningeal enhancement. Coming to vascular complications, you have superior ophthalmic vein thrombosis, cavernous sinus thrombosis. If it's frontal sinusitis, you can get superior sagittal sinus thrombosis. And finally, if you have involvement of the cavernous sinus, you can have arterial spasm and arthritis. This is an example of cavernous sinus thrombosis, again showing you opacification of the paranasal sinuses, especially on the left. You can see on the non-contrast CT there is bulging of the cavernous sinus. This is a post-contrast CT showing you filling defects within the sinus suggestive of cavernous sinus thrombosis, again very beautifully seen on the coronal post-contrast CT. You can see that filling defect really well. And then you look at the cavernous internal carotid artery. Compared to the other side, the cavernous internal carotid artery is decreased in caliber, suggesting there's arthritis/spasm of the vessel. And you need to pay attention to this because they can later develop strokes from this. So that's something to pay attention to. And in this case, actually, the other thing that you can see is basically, if you look at the superior ophthalmic vein, you can see the superior ophthalmic vein on the normal side. You can see over here, there's a filling defect within the superior ophthalmic vein. So this patient also has superior ophthalmic vein thrombosis in addition to the left cavernous sinus thrombosis. This is the same patient's MR, again showing you infected secretions within the left-sided paranasal sinuses. In addition, you can see extensive post-septal cellulitic changes, no abscess formation, extensive preseptal edema. Again, flare showing, this is a fat sat flare. So normally the fat sats out. Here you can see there's all this hazy increased intensity within the fats, which tells you that there are cellulitic changes. You can see all the extraocular muscles are thickened and edematous. So there are myocytic changes in the orbit. Coming to the post-contrast scans, you can see all the enhancement in the preseptal and post-septal space. But what's concerning is, if you look at the flare and T2, you can see that the left cavernous sinus wall is bulging laterally. It's actually best seen on this post-contrast T1. You can see these large filling defects within the sinus, suggesting sinus thrombosis. And you look at the ICA, you can see that the ICA is narrowed. So there's arterial spasm/arthritis. And this is again showing you the superior ophthalmic vein thrombosis as well as the post-septal orbital cellulitic changes. So how does cavernous sinus thrombosis look? So you get a convex lateral border. Normally you have this kind of a concavity of the lateral margin of the lateral border. In this case, what happens is that you get convexity of the lateral border. You can have abnormal T1 and T2 signal depending on the age of the blood clot. You can see gas in the sinus, and then obviously on the contrast scans you see filling defects. Now, MRV is not the best of modalities to detect cavernous sinus thrombosis. It's best seen on the post-contrast images. So that's the way to go. Either you can do a post-contrast CT or an MR. This is another example, but here I'll just highlight how of superior ophthalmic vein thrombosis looks. This is a patient, again, patient has preseptal cellulitic changes. You can see this is the normal superior ophthalmic vein. This is the abnormal side. You see the tram track sign, you see the central filling defect and some peripheral enhancement. This is how it looks on the coronal. You can see the central filling defect and surrounding enhancement of the wall from phlebitis. And in addition to that, you can also see that this is the normal fat. You can see, I don't know if you can appreciate it, but this fat looks dirty or hazy. So there are also these, and on the coronal you can see that very well. See how the normal fat looks, all this haziness, and so it just suggests there's some post-septal cellulitic changes. Now in addition, I just want to highlight, in this patient didn't have sinusitis, but this was an example where a patient had a spider bite, and this was an example where the preseptal cellulitis actually spread back and involved the post-septally the superior ophthalmic vein. And when you look very closely, look at the cavernous sinus, look at the normal side. It's got concave lateral borders. Here it's got convex lateral borders and huge filling defects. So this basically extended back into the cavernous sinus. So you have superior ophthalmic vein thrombosis as well as cavernous sinus thrombosis, all from a spider bite, because the infection actually transgressed the orbital septum and extended posteriorly. This is the same patient's MR. I'll just quickly show it to you guys, again showing you all the cellulitic changes within the orbit. And I just want to kind of highlight the involvement of the superior ophthalmic vein, because that's what I want to show this slide for. Again, showing you that central filling defect and surrounding enhancement, cellulitic changes in the, you see how the normal fat looks. There's all this dirty, hazy enhancement and stranding within the fat consistent with post-septal cellulitic changes. This is again the filling defects on the post-contrast T1 weighted image suggesting cavernous sinus thrombosis. And on the diffusion weighted image, you can see there is actually restricted diffusion in the sinus, suggesting that this is all infected thrombus. And when you look at the the caliber of the ICAs. You see how narrow it is, and look at the MRA. You can see this entire lateral as well as cavernous segment of the ICA is narrowed from vessel spasm/arthritis, and you need to pay close attention because these patients again can go ahead and get strokes from this. So this is a good example of ICA arthritis/vessel wall spasm. The final complication we'll look at in sinusitis is superficial complication, which can either be osteomyelitis of the overlying bone or subgaleal abscess, which is actually also called Pott's-Puffy tumor. So Pott's-Puffy tumor is seen with frontal sinusitis, which leads to thrombophlebitis within the emissary veins. There's necrosis of the inner and outer tables of the skull and an associated subperiosteal abscess formation. What you see on imaging, you basically here you can see that there is frontal sinusitis. When you look at the bone windows, you can see there's all this neo-osteogenesis or thickened bone with this, almost like periosteal reaction. So there's frontal bone osteomyelitic changes, and there's this extensive frontal subgaleal thickening. This is obviously a non-contrast CT, so we can't look for collections because usually collections are these small hypodensities which peripherally enhance. So again, the sagittal view showing you the sinus, showing you the that thickening of the bone as well as associated subgaleal thickening. Another example, this is an MR. This is another patient who's got frontal sinusitis. Here you can see the frontal soft tissue thickening, but in addition on the post-contrast, you can see that small subgaleal fluid collection, which is an abscess. So this is an example of Pott's-Puffy tumor. Here you can see on the diffusion weighted image, the sinus as well as that subgaleal collection are enhancing, suggesting purulent material. And this is a close-up view of that subgaleal collection, so Pott's-Puffy tumor. So I mean, it depends on how you want to call it, but I think the better term to call it is a subgaleal abscess because that's what it is pathologically and anatomically. So another example, again, these subgaleal collections can be very small, and like I said, unless you know where to look for, you'll miss them. This is a patient again who has supraorbital ethmoid as well as frontal sinusitis. Again, you see the cellulitic changes and this very small subgaleal abscess. Now pay close attention to what's happening intracranially. There's this almost tiny epidural abscess, which if you're not looking for, you can miss it. So always pay attention to look intracranially because that's something which you don't want to miss. Again, this is the same patient on MR showing you that subgaleal abscess right there. So next we'll look at some of the facial, oral, pharyngeal and neck infections. I'll try to cover as much as I can because I got a lot of stuff in there. So first we'll talk about the most important of these is the retropharyngeal abscess, and there are a few things I want to touch in this. So we'll look at the slides ahead. So how does retropharyngeal abscess form? It occurs because of spread of infection to the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, either from tonsillitis, pharyngitis, otitis, or other infections of the oral cavity. There are other causes including trauma from foreign body ingestion, or it can be iatrogenic, during scopies. So what do you see on imaging? You see rim enhancing collection in the retropharyngeal space, and it's very important, and I'll go ahead, I'll show these examples in my slide. It's very different. It's very important to differentiate an abscess from retropharyngeal cellulitis, and we'll see how we can differentiate that. And it's important to recognize this because you have a variety of complications, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but mediastinitis is a big one because the retropharyngeal space is very close to the danger space. Actually, it's just in front of the danger space, and danger space is a space from where infection can actually track down to the mediastinum. The retropharyngeal space is also very close to the carotid vessels, so you can get involvement of the carotid artery or the internal jugular vein. And finally, you can aspirate these retropharyngeal abscesses and develop a pneumonia or empyema. So I'll just show you examples. This is an example of a kid who's got this on this plain lateral radiograph. You can see extensive retropharyngeal edema and swelling. This patient gets a CT, and you can see that there is this rim enhancing collection within the retropharyngeal space, and you can see that this is irregular. So how it starts is that usually you have some kind of infection, oral or otitis, and then the drainage pathway is to the retropharyngeal lymph node. The retropharyngeal lymph node suppurates, and then so initially you have a suppurative lymph node, and then when that suppurative lymph node bursts, then you get a retropharyngeal abscess. So here you can actually almost see it. This is the node, and over here you can see that this is like the burst component of it, or the portion which is actually extending into the retropharyngeal space. And this is showing you that peripheral enhancement. Sometimes it's hard to see it. You might have to narrow your windows, but that's something which you should pay attention to and look for. Obviously, you can see there's mass effect. You can see that the carotid vessels are displaced laterally, and you can see there's mass effect on the airway, which is pushed anteriorly and to the right. This is an example of what retropharyngeal cellulitis looks like. So this is here you see a hypodensity which doesn't show much peripheral enhancement within the right retropharyngeal space. You can see the carotid artery it's narrowed. See that? This is the coronal view again showing you narrowing of that carotid artery. This is the normal caliber and this is where it's narrowed. In addition to that, you see all these large homogeneously enhancing lymph nodes surrounding this hypodensity, which are basically reactive large nodes. In addition to that, this patient also has retropharyngeal effusion, which is like a sympathetic effusion related to all this infection/inflammation in this space. And on the coronal view, you can see very nicely that this is that lymph node which is edematous but not enhancing. So it's probably it's phlegmon/cellulitis going towards early abscess formation but not yet formed an abscess. So this is a good example of node which is about to suppurate, or a node which has got phlegmon in it, but it's not liquefied yet. And it's important to differentiate this, because if a surgeon goes in, they're not going to find pus in this case. So you want to tell them that this is probably just phlegmonous changes, nothing to drain in here. So that's the important thing that I'm trying to hit at. You want to identify the abscess, because that's when the surgeon can go in and drain the abscess. In this case, if the surgeon goes in, they're not going to get any abscess because it's just phlegmon still. This is another good example of showing you how phlegmon goes towards abscess. Here's an example. Here you see the hypodensity, no peripheral enhancement, again showing you the cellulitic change, or rather not even suppurative node, it's just phlegmon. There's no enhancement. And then this is on the initial scan. Follow-up scan, you can see there's all this peripheral enhancement. Now the edema has become, now you can see that the abscess is almost like it's perforated and extended further. So this is actually now a retropharyngeal abscess. You can see that enhancement now, which was not there previously. So this is retropharyngeal abscess. The surgeon goes in and drains this. This is still phlegmon. They can't drain anything, so they can't take them to surgery here, but definitely here, they need to drain it. So again, showing you the ICS stenosis there. So this is a nice article I found. I think this is from American Journal of Radiology. It's just showing you the different types of this. So first one is retropharyngeal edema, which is basically just a sympathetic effusion. On axial images, you have this kind of bow tie appearance. It doesn't enhance, no enhancement at all. You see on the sagittal images, you almost have this lenticular kind of hypodensity, and it's got this tapering superior and inferior ends. And you need to, when you see just a simple effusion, you look for other causes for it. So you want to look for whether there's any infection or inflammatory changes in the retropharyngeal space. You want to look if there is internal jugular vein thrombosis, because that can give rise to a sympathetic effusion. Then another condition in adults that you see is basically calcific tendinosis of the longus coeli muscle. So that's something which you want to look for in adults. You look for calcification around C1, C2 anteriorly. And sometimes, not sometimes, most of the times the patients are post-chemoradiation, you can see a benign sympathetic retropharyngeal effusion. So you want to look for the cause of that if it's just a benign sympathetic effusion. So this is an example of a benign sympathetic effusion, again bow tie configuration. And you can see it's non-enhancing and it's got that tapered superior and inferior margin. This is an example of a phlegmonous change or an early, this is actually an early suppurative node. You can see some peripheral enhancement. But it's still confined to the node. There is no extension to the retropharyngeals. It's not burst into the retropharyngeal space. And this is an example of a retropharyngeal abscess where you can see that it's ruptured into the retropharyngeal space, and now there is a peripheral enhancement. And then obviously you want to look for the other source of the primary infection, or either an otitis media or tonsillitis, or look for a foreign body or traumatic causes or whatever, and other look for complications like we discussed previously, like the ICA narrowing or the jugular vein thrombosis and things like that. So how do you treat it? If it's cellulitis or small abscess, you treat with IV antibiotics. If it's a larger abscess, you incise and drain. And this is a good article. I think this was in the American Journal of Neuroradiology. This was actually from the group at Emory. And they said that despite the dramatic narrowing of the ICA ipsilateral to retropharyngeal lymphadenitis and abscess, none of the children in the series had neurologic deficits, suggesting that such narrowing is a common benign and most likely incidental imaging finding, especially in these kids with retropharyngeal abscess. So even though it doesn't, clinically it's a benign condition, but something which you want to look for and put down in your report. So looking at tonsillitis, I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's basically it's a clinical diagnosis, and they're treated with antibiotics. And then these are the pathogens. They're listed here. So this is an example of tonsillitis, enlarged kissing tonsils. And many times you can see enhancement of the crypts, giving that kind of tigroid appearance. So when you image, basically you image if you want to look for complications, differentiate tonsillitis from peritonsillar abscess. And when do you image? You image when there are atypical clinical manifestations. If there's trismus that limits physical exam, or there is failure to resolve despite adequate antibiotic treatment, and if there is clinical suspicion of extension into the deep spaces of the neck. So here's an example of tonsillitis, again showing you enlargement and enhancement of the tonsils and enlargement of the draining lymph nodes. Now, sometimes you can actually be very specific as to the cause. So if you see adenotonsillitis with lymphadenitis, you can consider specific organisms such as group A beta hemolytic strep and Epstein-Barr virus. So those are the two common things that you see with adenotonsillitis and lymphadenitis. And in toddlers, if you see adenotonsillitis with lymphadenopathy, consider Kawasaki's disease. So this is an example where the patient had adenotonsillitis, a toddler, and you can see there are bilateral subclavian/brachial artery aneurysms, and this patient also has a coronary artery aneurysm. So you want to pay attention to look for these other things, and sometimes you can, this was a case that I saw at CHOP, so interesting. So complication is basically a peritonsillar abscess. True intratonsillar abscesses are rare. The infection commonly penetrates the space between the tonsillar capsule and the superior constrictor muscle, and then from once it spreads there, once it gets there, it can spread into the parapharyngeal space and then extend into multiple other spaces. And we'll look at examples. So this is an example of a peritonsillar abscess, rim enhancing collection, and this is another example where the peritonsillar abscess is actually extended into the parapharyngeal space. And in such cases, actually, it's very easy to see how this can be confused with a retropharyngeal necrotic lymph node. So you actually need to scroll and look if there is a peritonsillar abscess just connecting to that. So you have to actually look at all the images. It's very difficult to explain this just on one static image. Coming to dacrocystitis, this is an inflammation and dilatation of the lacrimal sac, and it's usually secondary to obstruction of the nasolacrimal duct. Clinically, they present with a medial canthal mass, lid swelling, conjunctivitis, purulent discharge. Just quickly show you examples. So here's an example of dacrocystitis. Here's a the hypodensity in the lacrimal fossa, and you can see the surrounding enhancement. Also, you can see preseptal cellulitic changes. And then when you look at the nasolacrimal duct, you can see it's larger than the left side, and it's also filled with secretions. So dacrocystitis with obstruction of the nasolacrimal duct. So this is the clinical picture, again showing you that medial canthal swelling and preseptal cellulitic changes. Another example, again showing you that hypodensity in the lacrimal fossa, as well as enlargement of the nasolacrimal duct, which is filled with secretions. I'm going to skip this. So diagnosis is basically clinical, and sometimes lid swelling may preclude examination and necessitate imaging. So what we saw was this hypodense mass or peripherally enhancing mass centered in the lacrimal fossa. And sometimes you can see complications such as periorbital or orbital cellulitis, so you want to look for that. Now we'll quickly look at these branchial cleft cysts, and it's important to understand this because they get confused and there are a lot of differential diagnoses for this. So the most common branchial cleft cyst is the type 2 branchial cleft cyst. The classic location is anteromedial to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, anterolateral to the carotid arteries, and posterior to the submandibular gland. So this is actually a cartoon showing the type 2 branchial cleft cyst, and you can see sometimes you can have an entire tract which is extending from the faucial tonsils and can extend all the way down to the lower anterior neck. Clinically, they can either present with swelling, and if it's infected, they can have a painful fluctuant mass. All imaging modalities are going to show you a cystic lesion in the appropriate anatomic location, and treatment is basically surgical treatment. So this is an example, classic location, cystic mass, anteromedial to the sternocleidomastoid, posterior to the submandibular gland, and lateral to the carotid vessels. Now, I just for the residents and fellows in the room, I just want to kind of highlight that you have to understand that when you see something like this cystic in an adult, the first diagnosis is not going to be branchial cleft cyst, it's going to be a metastatic necrotic squamous cell carcinoma lymph node, because I've seen a lot of people call it in the adults. That's the first, if you see a necrotic or other cystic appearing mass in an adult, your number 1 to 10 diagnosis is going to be metastatic necrotic lymph nodes or metastasis from a papillary thyroid carcinoma, which can also be very fluid-like. But in kids, you can see this, so obviously you want to put that in your, always keep that in the back of your mind. You don't want to diagnose branchial cleft cyst in a 40-year-old. This is another example of a branchial cyst. In this case, you can see that there is some enhancement along the inferior margin of the cyst, suggesting that it is infected. You can see some cellulitic changes, a little bit of standing of the fat around it. So this is an infected branchial cyst type 2. Again, you can see the classic location. Another example, this one actually is on the left side. You can see there's enhancement suggesting there's some infection, and also in this case you can also see some debris within the dependent portion of the cyst. So the debris could either be hemorrhagic or infection. So again, when you see something like this, your other differential diagnosis is a lymphatic malformation. So the other differential in this case would be either a branchial cleft cyst which is infected or a lymphatic malformation which has bled or got infected. So that's something to keep at the back of your mind. Now we'll look at type 1 branchial cleft cyst. Again, this cyst is closely related to the parotid gland, and it typically extends into the EAC or the external auditory canal. Clinically, they present with recurrent abscesses near the ear or the angle of the mandible. And imaging, basically you see a cystic lesion which is associated around the parotid gland or the EAC, and this is a schema showing you there are two types of type 1 branchial cleft cyst. It's actually called the Work classification. This is the type 1, which extends from the junction of the cartilaginous and bony EAC, and it goes parallel to the EAC and extends up to the auricle. And this is an example of a type 2, which extends from the EAC and goes all the way down to the angle of the mandible. So showing you an example, this is a type 2. So you can see this one extends from the EAC, goes all the way down. You can see this tubular structure goes all the way down to the angle of the mandible where you see a large abscess. You can see that all that phlegmon and abscess within near the angle of the mandible. And then on diffusion, obviously, you see all that purulent material showing restricted diffusion. This is how it looked clinically. Just want to show you a video of this, because it's very hard to appreciate just on static images. So just pay attention to the EAC. So that's the junction of the bony and cartilaginous EAC. You can see that tract going down to the angle of the mandible, and there's a big abscess. So that's a type 2 Work classification type 1 branchial cyst. I don't want to confuse you, but that's what it is. So this is another example here. This is a type 1, Work type 1 branchial cleft cyst. So here you can see this is again extending from the EAC. Here you can see it's almost parallel to the EAC and extends laterally towards the pinna. This is how it looked clinically before and after surgery. Again, over here the differential diagnosis is going to be an epidermoid/dermoid inclusion cyst. But the fact that it extended to the EAC made this likely to be a type 1 branchial cleft cyst. Again, type 4 branchial cleft cyst.
Microphone, you might check the microphone. Is the button on? It might have hit. Or not on the plug.
Oh, where is this?
Or it dies. Check the battery still. Not working.
You take one of my pager then.
Here, let's see. I'll see if I can fix it for you.
Battery?
Here. Triple A.
I can go get some batteries and I'll replace it.
I think I'm just going to.
Here you go.
Yes. Oh, perfect. It's working.
Pretty good. Just needed. Go ahead and try.
So this is a type 4 branchial cleft cyst. It should be considered in the presence of any cervical or thyroid abscess. Most commonly occur on the left side, but you can also see them on the right as I'll show you examples. So this is actually a cartoon showing you a sinus tract extending from the piriform sinus apex, extending towards the thyroid gland with a thyroid abscess and surrounding inflammatory changes. This is an example, again showing you an abscess and phlegmonous changes in the right lobe of the thyroid gland. You can see there's mass effect and deviation of the trachea. And when you go superiorly, you can see almost on the coronal images, you can see that this inflammatory process extends up to the piriform sinus, and you can see there's edematous change. This is a normal piriform sinus on the contralateral side, and you can see it's collapsed there. And this is a sagittal image. And again, searching for these tracts is difficult during the acute stage of inflammation because the tract becomes edematous and it collapses. So you usually wait for the infection or the inflammation to subside and then start looking for that tract.
I guess just some new batteries. I'll
Okay.
probably have to get. There might be some in the drawer. Sorry about that. Not letting you lecture with no kinks today, huh? I don't see batteries here, but it's just the stroke pager. There's only one there. Do you think I can come back in like 2 minutes and I'll have you batteries and have it working? If you can continue without, yeah. I'll be right back with
So like I said, you usually wait for the inflammation to subside to look for that tract, because when the tract is edematous and there's inflammation, the tract may collapse and you may not actually pick up the tract. So this is actually the MR of the same patient, again showing you all those changes in the right lobe of the thyroid gland. And then obviously the abscess is showing you restricted diffusion on the DWI images. What I actually want to show you is the next slide, which is actually this patient was taken to they did a microlaryngoscopy on this patient after like a couple of months. And you can see over here there's a sinus tract within the apex of the piriform sinus, which they actually coagulated or cauterized. So you want to wait for the inflammation to subside so that you can detect that tract. So on imaging, what do you see? You see a sinus tract extending from the apex of the piriform sinus to the lower anterior neck on barium swallow. The CT will show you the cyst or the abscess, and the abscess can be in or adjacent to the anterior thyroid lobe, and CT after barium swallow can show you the entire tract. And so the easiest way is to directly inject if there's a fistula, and it can show you the course of the tract. This is actually a differential diagnosis to that. So this is another example. You can see this peripherally enhancing collection, but it's actually in the lower neck, but you can see that the lesion is actually separate from the thyroid gland, which is actually pushed posteriorly. And you can see that this is a coronal view, and you see that this collection extends more inferior to the thyroid lobe, and it extends on the sagittal view from the hyoid all the way down into the lower neck. And this is a video just to show you, and that, by the way, that's the history, 23-month-old with fever and left-sided swelling with cystic chain identified on ultrasound. You can see that there's that collection. You can see the left lobe of the thyroid is separate and going all the way down. So they actually, this was actually diagnosed as a thyroglossal duct cyst, which is infected. And the important thing I want to stress here is when you have infrahyoid thyroid cyst, thyroglossal duct cyst, they can actually be off midline. And when you look at the strap muscle, you can see over here the strap muscle is kind of pushed anteriorly by this cyst, and then the thyroid gland is pushed back. But obviously the differential in this case would be a type 4 branchial cleft cyst. But in this case, I'll show you, they did an MR like 5 months later, and you can see over here there are two cystic components. There's one here which you also saw on the CT, that smaller medial cystic component. And you can see on the T1 that this cyst has got very proteinaceous content. It's bright on T1. When it's bright on T1, it tells you that it's got proteinaceous content. No restricted diffusion. Obviously, there's no infection at this point. And you can see over here, there's that small tail of extension towards the hyoid bone. Again, this patient was taken to surgery, and what they saw was this mass abutting the left thyroid lobe. There was no fistula identified. And then obviously, because they thought it was a thyroglossal duct cyst, they took out the central hyoid bone in continuity to the mass, and finally the pathology was a thyroglossal duct cyst. So that's something to keep at the back of your mind. Also, thyroglossal duct cysts can mimic these type 4 branchial cleft cysts. Obviously, you don't see them so low down in the neck, but that's something to think of. Coming to odontogenic infections, basically, if you have, let me show you this picture and we'll go back to this. So this is actually the mylohyoid muscle divides divides two spaces. So if you are above the mylohyoid muscle, you are in the sublingual space. And if you're below the mylohyoid sling, then you are in the submandibular space. Now you have something called the mylohyoid line on the mandible, which is actually where the muscle inserts. And you can see over here that these posterior teeth actually go below the mylohyoid line. So the infection actually goes into the submandibular space because it's below the mylohyoid muscle. As well as these more anterior teeth, their roots are actually above the mylohyoid muscle. So the infection is limited to the sublingual space because it's above the mylohyoid muscles. That's what I want to kind of show with that slide. So this is an example where you can see there's a periapical abscess which is actually burst through the mandible. There's a mandibular cortical dehiscence, and you can see mandibular osteomyelitic changes. There's sclerosis as well as osteolysis, and then there's destruction of the bone, and you can see periosteal reaction here. When you look at the soft tissue windows, you can see there are cellulitic changes in the overlying mandibular buccal space. So this was odontogenic infection which has actually spread out to the mandibular buccal space. Another example is this kid who has got these periapical abscesses involving the maxillary incisors. And then when you look very closely at the bone window, you can see there's kind of a bony dehiscence along the buccal cortex. And then you see this small subperiosteal abscess there. I don't know if you can appreciate it. You see that? And then you see that over here. There's all this lip swelling here, and then that small subperiosteal abscess. So again, odontogenic infection. This is the clinical picture of that patient, that extensive swelling of the upper lip. treatment, you basically extract the tooth, you can drain the abscess, and then obviously IV antibiotic therapy. I think I'll skip Ludwig's angina because we don't see it that commonly. I'll just go to suppurative lymph nodes. So lymph nodes, basically how they suppurate is you have spread of infection to the node, and then the node undergoes liquefactive necrosis, and the most common pathogens are strep and staph. And what you see over here, basically what you see is this necrotic lymph node with surrounding enhancement, and obviously you can also see these surrounding large reactive appearing nodes which are surrounding the suppurative node. And then in this case you can see that there's compression of the IJV. Also, you also want to look for IJV thrombosis, and you can see surrounding cellulitic changes over here. And then this patient also has a sympathetic retropharyngeal effusion. So again, like I said, it's very difficult to differentiate. Sometimes you have to give differential diagnosis. This is an example of a suppurative jugulo-digastric lymph node, and this is an example of a patient with an infected branchial cleft cyst. So you want to always keep things in your differential diagnosis. And usually with a branchial cleft cyst, you'll get recurrent infections versus a suppurative lymph node is usually a one-time infection. So something to think of. I don't know if I'll have, do I have time to go over the parotid or? So we'll go, I mean, I've just divided the sialoadenitis into parotid gland, and then we'll look at the other sialoadenitis. There are different causes for it. It can be bacterial, viral, or calculus related. Again, these are the common pathogens, and the complications are in the parotid gland. You can have abscess formation, you can get thrombophlebitis of the retromandibular or facial vein, and you can have cranial nerve 7 dysfunction, the facial nerve dysfunction. There's an example of parotitis. The right parotid gland is enlarged, inflamed, you see surrounding cellulitic changes, and ill-defined margins. Obviously, there's no intraparotid abscess at this point. This is an example of a patient who's got an enlarged and inflamed right parotid, and you can see this intraparotid abscess inside there, right there, and those can be drained. Obviously, you want to look for, like I said, thrombophlebitis of the retromandibular vein, which is not in this case, and also you want to look, basically, I'll show you an example, but on CT, obviously, you can't see enhancement of the facial nerve, but that's something which you can see on MR. Another example of a intraparotid, so this is basically parotid infection with an intraparotid abscess. Like I said, the other differential in this case would be an infected lymphatic malformation or a type 2 branchial cleft cyst, type 1 branchial cleft cyst, the work classification 2. I don't want to confuse you guys, but this is an example of a kid who had 8-year-old with a right parotid swelling with near complete facial paralysis and upper lip rash. So they suspected some kind of viral etiology. You can see there's very subtle enlargement and enhancement of the right parotid gland on the post-contrast scans, and then you can see there are some enlarged intraparotid lymph nodes which you can see on the T2 weighted image, especially this one here along the posterior aspect. And when you look at the post-contrast MR images, you can see this is the mastoid segment of the facial nerve. Normally it does enhance, but when you normally what you want to use as a reference is an internal reference is basically your opposite facial nerve. So in this case, you're not seeing much enhancement on the contralateral side, but you're seeing it on this side. So there was facial neuritis also in this case. And obviously you see some reactive lymph nodes, so presumed viral parotitis. Usually viral parotitis is bilateral, but you may see it unilateral. And these are the causes. Most common is the mumps virus. So treatment of acute parotiditis is hydration and antibiotic therapy and drainage if there is an abscess. Now this second topic I've kind of kept it separate, sialoadenitis, because I'm going to talk about the submandibular and sublingual glands in this. And what you're going to see is basically enlarged and enhancing gland. You'll see surrounding cellulitis and myositis. And then, if many a times sialoadenitis is because of a calculus in the duct, so you can see ductal dilatation or secondary to an obstructive calculus or stenosis if you see it. So I'll show you an example. This is a case of just a bacterial sialoadenitis. You see enlargement of the submandibular gland, which is enlarged and enhancing, surrounding inflammatory changes, cellulitic changes in the soft tissues, and a few reactive lymph nodes. This is an example of sialoadenitis secondary to a calculus. So if you see unilateral sialoadenitis, you want to also think of a calculus. In this case, you can see this is an MR image, T2 weighted image showing you the gland is a little bit larger, and you can see it's enhancing more than the contralateral side. You can see that the intraglandular ducts are enlarged, and then when you look at the extraglandular duct, you can see that duct is enlarged and there is a stone within the duct. So that's the stone on the coronal view, and that's the dilated duct, that's the normal contralateral duct. So just to show you a calculus was the cause of sialoadenitis. Coming to Lemierre syndrome, this is an uncommon and life-threatening complication of acute respiratory tract infection. The primary infection is a sore throat. Then you get thrombophlebitis of the septic thrombophlebitis of the IJV, and that gives rise to this neck swelling. Here you see that there's thrombophlebitis of the external jugular vein. And then you get metastatic complications with disseminated abscesses and septic pulmonary emboli. And the causative organism is this Fusobacterium necrophorum. And I'll show you what the pathogenesis is. So basically you have an infection, and then the organisms pass from the tonsillar vein into the IJV. The bacterial tonsils in the IJV produce platelet aggregation and septic thrombus formation. And then these septic emboli lodge in the lungs, liver, endocardium, and or joints. So show you an example. This is a patient with Lemierre. So you can see there is IJV thrombosis right there. This is the Doppler image showing you, the color Doppler image showing you the thrombus within the IJV. And these are basically septic emboli in the lungs, and one of them has cavitated. So this is Lemierre syndrome. So we looked at the major infections, and I don't know if I have time for airway obstruction or if you want me to stop, because there's a lot of, I don't want to kind of overwhelm you with data.
Massive amount of cases, beautiful cases. Any questions for Kailas?
Yes, I'm from otolaryngology. We frequently treat cholesteatomas, and postoperatively, we're very interested in recurrent or residual disease. And in the past, we've depended on statements such as there may be fluid or soft tissue present, non-specific information. Can you say anything about newer methods of more specific diagnosis?
Yes, there is something called, there are these new deep, actually to answer it, it's very hard on CT to know if it's recurrent cholesteatoma or it's granulation tissue, or if it is, it's hard on CT. MR is the way to go for that, and there is this new non-EPI diffusion weighted image, and depending on what vendor you have the scanner, you have different names. It's called Resolve EPI, non-EPI, it's a non-EPI diffusion, because traditionally EPI is, it's called echoplanar imaging. It's a sequence where you get a lot of artifacts near the skull base and near bone. So this non-EPI diffusion basically is a newer type of diffusion which has lesser susceptibility artifacts and lesser distortion of bone. It's good for picking up recurrent cholesteatomas. So where I worked previously, they would use that for all the recurrent cholesteatomas, and it's really a phenomenal tool to actually differentiate recurrent cholesteatoma from granulation tissue.
Thank you. We do parallel.
No. That's another way to do it, but I think that non-EPI diffusion is the way to. I think it's called Resolve on Siemens or EPI.
We do diffusion non-EPI.
Okay, that's the way to go actually. And obviously, if you have bony erosion and bony destruction, you know for sure. But you know, in the post-operative setting, it's a little bit harder on CT. I think MR is the way to go. And there are people who actually just have tailored protocols just to just looking at that. So they just have few sequences, like it's a quick scan. So you put the patient in, you just do a couple of sequences, and then the patient's out. So you're just looking at the temporal bone. You add in the diffusion. You add in a T2 and T1. You don't even give. Many people don't even give contrast because it doesn't help you much with contrast. You know, to differentiate between recurrent cholesteatoma or granulation tissue. So they just T1, T2 and diffusion, and then non-EPI diffusion. That's the way to go.